distinguished members of the faculty of this distinguished university, and so many familiar faces, friends, all of you here in the row, all of you there, many of whom I have spoken with, lectured with, traveled abroad with, and above all, of course, especially all the students from different departments and years. Friends, a Granville Austin memorial lecture in India can easily consume the memorial lecturer's entire time limit of 45 minutes to 60 minutes on this enigma of a man, on that subject alone, on his thinking, his life and his motivations. It would in fact leave me no time to speak on the subject of today's lecture. Given those constraints, given the fact that much has already been written about this great friend of India, given the fact that he has been critiqued and commented upon by people like the eminent Professor Upen Bakshi, given the fact that you have people like Professor Sudarshan and my good friend Vikram Raghavan, whom I met with Raj, all of whom knew him better personally than I did, I will necessarily restrict my remarks on him. I first met Austin in the late 80s or early 90s, when both he and I were much younger, after his second coming to India at Professor Sudarshan's bidding, that coming largely being because of Professor Sudarshan's persuasion. I was a much younger lawyer, partly in awe of him already, and yet he was extremely humble and self-effacing when he sought time from me. We met at his favourite haunt, IIC, India International Centre, also my favourite retreat in my student days, and he opened up in a very gentle and soft manner. He told me about his interactions with my father, showed me some handwritten notes by my father, and how my father introduced him to so many diverse lawyers in Delhi, as recounted also partly by Vikram in his article on Red Austin. Granville Austin then explained his unique style of interview and archival-based research, which made Cornerstone such a real flesh and blood book, a flesh and blood story. He especially mentioned his interviews with K.M. Munshi, who, as Vikram writes, was characterized by Austin as Mr. Activity in the Constituent Assembly. He mentioned it especially because Munshi was my father's legal and political guru, and my father had written a lot extensively for Munshi. So Austin had that connection as well, because he had read all the original material. I have always regretted that I was unable to keep in touch with this gentle and unassuming man. Despite fairly trenchant criticism of Cornerstone by as eminent a person as Professor Upen Bakshi, the two harbored no rancor. India partly repaid its debt to Austin by immortalizing him with special mention in the seminal Golaknath case, culminating in the rare honor of being cited by 12 out of 13 judges in Keshwananda Bharati. Thereafter, he remained a constant in Indian jurisprudence through Minerva Mills and many more related successors on this topic of basic structure. More recently, I was genuinely devastated to learn of the unfortunate financial distress on Austin and his family, though I didn't know about the morgue story, in the evening of his life, but was thrilled to meet with his wife and his daughter at an after-dinner lecture delivered by me at Washington, D.C. at the invitation of American billionaire entrepreneur Frank Islam, in the company of Raj, of course. My lecture also that evening at DC referred to Austin's contributions and the family's presence, unknown to me in advance. I got to know it after I had given the lecture, made it very special. All I can say as I turn to today's lecture theme is to express a fervent hope that more and more foreign scholars imbibe the empathy, the humility, the scholarship, the independence, the objectivity, and the internally inquisitive spirit, the digger, as Professor Sudarshan said, the eternally inquisitive spirit of this remarkable red-haired American. A red-haired American who studied Indian Constitution at England, Oxford, and made India his physical and intellectual karma bhumi for decades. Friends, the theme today is not just India's constitutional 75th birthday, but India's forthcoming centenary in 2047. It is the story of India's birth as a constitutional republic, its evolutionary trajectory over these 75 years, and its looking to the future with confidence, hope, and anticipation. It is this telescoping of the future of India's past with its future that is the broader theme I wish to address today. No doubt the Indian Constitution is a vital and foundational part of this journey. Hence, this sacred book finds focus, of course, in the title today. But I would say at the outset that it would be an incomplete lecture and indeed also a disservice to the great scholar in whose memory I speak today if India at 75 was only about its constitutional journey and not about its growth as an organic entity. All constitutional journeys are as much about governance as law, as much about the dynamics of politico-legal forces as about textual interpretation, as much about power and all its nasty, brutish underbelly as about jurisprudence. And that is also how Granville Austin saw it. A holistic approach was his hallmark. As Raghavan rightly puts it, for Austin, a holistic approach meant a seamless web comprising social revolution, national unity, democratic stability, constitutional politics, legal frameworks for managing power, and above all, a historical perspective on everything. And therefore, he was neither of them, but much more than all of them: a journalist, a historian, a lawyer, a constitutional theorist, a author and writer. Friends, when we talk of the future, of course, we must remember the contradictory thought process of two great Americans. Einstein, who said, "I never think of the future, it comes soon enough." And Lincoln, who said, "The most reliable way to deal with the future is to create it." So I, as some of you have already suffered parts of this lecture, always love to start this thematic address by asking a simple, in fact a very simplistic question, which really I have not found an answer to yet in foreign audiences or Indian audiences. And that is this simple and complex question is how, out of the 30 or 40 diverse different nations which emerged across Australasia, Asia, Middle East, Africa, South America, from the yoke of imperialism, from Dutch, Belgian, French, British imperialism, how is it that there is only one country and one country alone, and certainly of that size, India, which remains a vibrant democracy? Out of the 30, 40 which emerged from that yoke of imperialism from the 1930s to the 1960s. Because if you look around, the wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism litter the landscape across all these areas of Australasia, Africa, South America, and so on. And that is why many scholars have looked upon this miracle of sorts as a suspension of disbelief. Well, when I ask this question to myself, I have no real answer. So the first answer is that I have no answer. The second answer is sheer good luck. If I was forced to give a more logical answer, my favorite answer is that India was lucky to get its sequencing right. We got a Gandhi before a Nehru, and we got a Nehru after the Gandhi. There could be possibly no better agitational politician across the globe who could have got us independence as the half-naked fakir did. But equally, the jury is out as to what would have happened had he become India's first Prime Minister. Some people have used the word disaster. So the sequencing was right in that this slightly romantic, left-of-centre Fabian socialist Nehru, but above all with a deeply entrenched democratic spirit, a genuine belief in Voltaire's words that I will disagree with you completely but will defend to death your right to disagree with me. That democratic spirit with Nehru in the saddle as first Prime Minister. Nobody knows what would have happened had we not got this secret sauce, this Jugalbandi, in the right sequence. Nobody knows how the relatively over-idealist Gandhi and the relatively impractical Gandhi would have functioned as India's first Prime Minister. But it is certainly true that Nehru alone could never have got us independence. So I think that is the best answer I can think of. But it does remain a remarkable exception, a singular exception, that we have survived and prospered and thrived, barring an aberration, of course, which happens once in a while, but still a constitutional aberration, of a continuing democracy with the size and the scale and the poverty and the diversity which we have, well over 75 years now. So therefore, in these 75 years, Indian democracy may have been bent, but never broken, because law has stood firm and tall, and institutions have stood firm. So let us start at the beginning and look at some of the comparative aspects. In 1947 or 1950 to be more precise, the very fact that we insisted upon and did one man, one woman, one vote was itself quite a remarkable feature. Especially when we see that equality of genders in voting came to USA as late as 1920 and to UK as late as 1928, which is just a couple of decades before we implemented it. And how did we implement it? We had 173 million out of a population of 361 million voting in that first election. By the way, that first election was in 68 phases. It's the only election longer than the 8-phase 2-month election we have now. And it's stretched from September 1951 to February 1952. This figure in comparison in 2024 was 642 million voting in a population of 1400 million, and of this 642, 312 million were women. So this festival of democracy, this continuing thriving democracy as the sole exception of all those countries which emerged from the yoke of imperialism, has been quite a remarkable quantitative statistical achievement. The literacy rate, a pitiable 80-odd% in 1951, has, in a outdated census, above 75%, but really now beyond 85%, because we haven't had an updated census recently. So it's hovering somewhere around 85%. Some communities, some groups have 90% female literacy and 99% male literacy. But overall, it's about 85%. Our per capita is, on a dated basis, in 23-24, about 2.1 lakh rupees per annum, as against 274 rupees in 1952-53. And in real purchasing power parity terms, we are, in real money buying power terms, we are already for many years the third after China and the USA. Even otherwise, we are now threatening to overtake in terms of size, and we keep hearing this for the last 6 months. We're about to overtake Japan as the third largest economy. When India emerged as a sovereign democratic republic in 1950, the world looked on with skepticism, and not surprisingly. A newly decolonized nation, deeply diverse, economically impoverished, boldly adopted a universal adult franchise. This was not just an institutional decision. It was a civilizational commitment to human dignity, to equality, and to self-rule. India's democratic journey defied expectations, where many post-colonial states gravitated towards authoritarianism. India chose deliberation over diktat. The Indian Constitution tried to offer both a moral compass and an institutional framework to tie the Republic together. And when we celebrate 75 years of democracy, we must ask what makes this Indian experiment so exceptional? And of course, what are the evolving challenges that call for renewal, not just of laws, not just of institutions, but of the democratic spirit itself? So I now turn to the second broad head of the more direct theme, which is to underline and recognize briefly, very briefly, the institutional and the non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy, which have stood firm in this journey. Remember, institutions are not brick and mortar ones. They are habits of fairness. They are issues of courage and constitutional fidelity, ultimately. And in many ways, the non-institutional pillars are even more important than the institutional pillars. The three most important non-institutional pillars are the ones which are related closely and cross-fertilize each other. Two mentioned in the constitutional text and one not mentioned. On that third one not mentioned, I am giving a back-to-back lecture only on that one word, federalism, tomorrow. So I will not take too much time today. But the three which cross-fertilize each other, which are linked directly as the most fundamental pillars, non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy, are firstly secularism, secondly fraternity, and thirdly federalism. Secularism, irrespective of the many debates about it, the very fact that India is planet Earth's most diverse spot. You can use any word you like, salad bowl or melting pot, none of those do justice to the fact that planet Earth's most diverse spot is India. And the diversity of smell, sound, ritual, dress, religion, habit, speech, language, whatever, is just so bewildering. To take one example of linguistic, which I'll be dealing with federalism in tomorrow's lecture, because this linguistic federalism is a major issue in India now. There are 22 languages the Constitution recognizes, which actually hides many, many more languages. 700 mother tongues, 2,000 dialects. We are the birthplace of 4 religions and the second and third largest population of many more in the world. As I always say, it's a word which has been much abused, much distorted, much misunderstood, but possibly the best explanation, if not definition, which I found is Professor Bhargav's description by asking the question and applying Lincolnian test to secularism. Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, for the people. So Bhargav says, I can understand for the people, I can understand by the people. I don't understand why Lincoln said of the people. And then he says, of the people is supposed to signify a sense of belonging, of co-ownership, of each component of the republic, each citizen, each human being who can claim a share of that republic as a co-owner. And this brings in the heart of secularism, of belonging, of pluralism, of inclusiveness, which celebrates diversity. With, of course, the second word, fraternity, a much underutilized, underemphasized, underspoken word. But that is supposed to be the heart of constitutionalism. And though it's a very old word from the French Revolution and through the US Constitution, it is the one word which needs more celebration in theory and in law schools, and even much more in actual practice. Because a lot of the ills of the world are really by not practicing and understanding that cross-fertilizing word, fraternity. Federalism is a fascinating story, and certainly not my time to speak separately on it. But why it's remarkable and fascinating for a start is that it's the only word you don't find in the world's largest or third or fourth largest constitution. I don't know, it may be fourth. At the time when it came, Indian constitution was one of the largest in the world. And in the entire longest constitution of the world, you don't find the word federal. If you Google the Indian constitution, you'll find a lot of the word federal. But all those words federals are about the predecessor of the Supreme Court, the federal court. There is no federalism, not only in the preamble, but in the text alone. And something which has no mention in the preamble or the text has become, from way back in the 90s, in fact, even from Keshwananda, a part of the basic structure. Because this is another celebration of diversity. This is another way of dealing with dissent, discomfort and dissatisfaction, and quarantining such conflicts at local levels or decentralized levels, and preventing an explosion at the center top. The other remarkable feature of federalism is that while we all know that the design of the Indian Constitution is largely centric, unitary, the Australian theorist Kenneth Ware called it quasi-federal. Many others say it's a unitary constitution pretending like a wolf in sheep's clothing to be a federal. But the fascinating part about it is that we have had, and there are now very good analysis of this, inadvertent and accidental federalism of a very high quality and degree, which has made India from design and conception to a totally different, much more federal operational entity in 75, 77 years. And that has happened, as maybe I'll touch briefly on, but much more elaborately in tomorrow's lecture at another location. Fiscal federalism, linguistic federalism, Panchayati Raj, the very active and prompt judicial review after the 20th century in this current millennium, unlike the previous century, which has virtually reduced 356 to an aberration and an exception. There were 100 uses of 356 prior to 2000, and there are about 15 or 20 after 2000. And of those 15 and 20, I've had the privilege of appearing in almost 80% cases. They've all been struck down. So people are very hesitant to use 356, which is the biggest antidote to federalism, because you can take over a state government. So fiscal federalism devolutions now, for example, when we started were below 30%. It's now going to touch 45% of devolution of funds by whatever name called, grants, funds, cesses, blah, blah. Linguistic federalism, though it is now raising its head again, largely from the 60s, the language riots of the 60s, which many of you have not heard about or seen, till the calm and equilibrium till today. Linguistic federalism, the creation of states on language and the devolution of state-level languages, has held its ground. Panchayati Raj has been the biggest numerical revolution. There are almost 2 million women sitting across the table if you go and deal with anything at the sub-level below the state. I've been a member of parliament now for nearly 20 years. If I go and do any parliamentary project in any state, and this ranges from Rajasthan to West Bengal to Telangana, more often than not, the person dealing with me will be a woman who will be panchayat head. These are all elected persons. And the time when they used to be controlled by their fathers, husbands, brothers, etc. is now gone. It's reduced quite a lot. So they take these decisions at the decentral levels. There's been a revolution by the 72nd and the 73rd amendments of the Constitution in in decentralization, which is the closest synonym you can have for federalism. Delicensing from 1985, and in particular the watershed year of 1991. Today, federalism's practical meaning is that a state chief minister is at least 4 times more powerful than a central cabinet minister, although in rank and protocol they are the same. The central minister has very limited power actually. Previously, the state chief minister used to need permission to even travel abroad for raising funds for his state. So these are some practical and some legal aspects of federalism. And of course, the other institutional and non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy. Obviously, I always say, doing the job of a fan dancer, touching upon these things without really covering it. Each of them are vital pillars: the CAG, the Election Commission, above all, parliamentary democracy, the temple of democracy, parliament, and the Parda Nashin lady we have here, army. So long as it remains Parda Nashin, India is a safe democracy. So you have all of these comprising and making our survival, promotion, growth and thriving of democracy over these years, despite seeing the wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism across the whole South Asian landscape and Africa and South America. The 5 critical features of India at its platinum jubilee, before I come to similar feature of the Indian Supreme Court, which I've tried to isolate. One is, of course, what I mentioned, institutionalizing democracy. That is clearly a critical achievement. One person, one woman, one man, one vote, the festival of democracy, which has, barring an occasional aberration, subsisted and thrived. We haven't yet had, I'm not saying about today, till recently we haven't had the phrase which in a so-called mature democracy like USA had become part of the folklore: stop the steal. Stop the steal is something you wouldn't think of being used in US till a few years ago. But you had a stop the steal campaign, you have a stop the steal movement, you have the stop the steal thought process. So democracy is very fragile, even in the places you think that it is very entrenched. Now, unfortunately, we are now having some of these doubts coming in this country, which is why it is important for that very important institutional pillar of Indian democracy, the Election Commission, to bend over backwards to practice transparency, to be utterly transparent and transparently independent. Because once you start doubting the process of institutionalizing democracy after every 5 years of elections, and in a mammoth country like India, the size is unbelievable, then you will slowly be deinstitutionalizing this great achievement of democracy. The second is that we've had constitutional democracy. It's not just democracy, not just elections. We have entrenched a whole set of constitutional values. I mean, every time I pick up the CAD, the Constituent Assembly debates, I always come back awed and amazed. Here were a group of people, now I would say in retrospect far wiser than us, who were surrounded by fundamental wrongs all around them. And as Granville Austin put it beautifully, from out of these carnage of fundamental wrongs around them, in 2.5 years, from 46 to 49, 3 years, they fashioned fundamental rights. They were very scared of fissiparous tendencies of the Indian Union, which is why they designed something more centric and unitary than federal. But they still spoke up for a liberal, human rights oriented, fundamental rights oriented system. It's easy to talk about it now, but if you sit in that assembly from 46 to 49 with 2 million people dying, trains coming with bodies, with complete distrust, with animosity, with communities, with fire, to design a constitution like this, to think like that, to not make India a theocratic state, to provide for such ringing declarations as you find from Article 14 or 13 right up to 30, 32. To even conceive of them is quite an achievement, is a remarkable achievement. And along with that, you designed not a constitutional democracy, but you also designed or attempted to design a social democracy. Something which the Germans and the Europeans talk about, that we have a social democratic republic, etc. Here you went to the Irish constitution and picked up this remarkable concept of directive principles of state policy. You added to it later, of course, much later, duties. But this whole dialectics of accepting that fundamental rights do have primacy, they are enforceable and they are vital. Though it was easy for the majority to deny fundamental rights in those troubled times. And then to counterbalance them by saying that though fundamental rights will remain priority, they must be imbued by the interpretive approach which looks at social democracy and all the articles in our DPSPs, Directive Principles of State Policy. And that complex interplay. So this is something which was again quite a miracle, something which historically we take for granted but needs to be celebrated. The framing of the Indian Constitution was itself a democratic act. It was deliberative, it was inclusive, and it was visionary. Figures like Dr. Ambedkar, Rajendra Prasad, Nehru, and many more recognized that the Constitution must reflect both ancient India's pluralism and its modern aspirations. Again, please rewind yourself and put yourself in those seats. To think like that and to create like that in those times is not easy. It was a product not of conquest, but of consensus. At its heart, they strove to enshrine the four cardinal values of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, each a bulwark against authoritarianism and inequality. These values were not ornamental. They were designed to shape governance, society, and citizenship. Through the doctrine of transformative constitutionalism, of course, Indian courts have taken the story much further. They have recognized the Indian Constitution as a dynamic instrument meant to foster social change. It does not merely limit state power, it mandates social justice, inclusivity, and dignity. And the basic structure doctrine, evolving from Keshwananda, reflects India's unique constitutional creativity. It asserts that democracy, secularism, rule of law, federalism cannot be legislated away, even by a parliamentary supermajority. And that, of course, is a later invention, but clearly I would put it in the category of India's pride and the world's envy. Though, sadly, in the last few years, we've had people with either less idea about the Indian Constitution or its spirit, or sheer ignorance, or bravado arising from political majorities, decrying, attacking, and denigrating this great concept. Let us now turn to some features of the Supreme Court as a bastion of all this, as a central theme in this journey of 75 years plus. Obviously, the constitutional text, already very vibrant, the product of 3 years of very engaging debate. And if you read the debates, by the way, there are completely contradictory views on the same page, on the same section. So out of the dialectics of thesis, antithesis, they somehow get synthesis at the end. And that's again no mean achievement. So this constitutional text, already imbued with the reflections and deliberations of the Assembly, was exponentially enlarged with constitutional context by the Supreme Court in the last 75 plus years, by multiple and ever dynamic layers of jurisprudence. 3 features alone, for example, judicial review, I always say, would make Marbury and Madison blush. The judicial review which we have today, which you study in your universities, would make Dycean theorists cringe. This is some different creature, a different species. It's all a development of jurisprudence by the court. The basic structure, which I refer to as the pride of India and the envy of the world, what a remarkable concept in one sentence. Even a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional. Again, a creation of dynamic constitutional Supreme Court jurisprudence. PIL, with a lot of problems. A very unruly horse requiring a dexterous rider, and frequently the judges who are supposed to be dexterous riders are becoming more and more scarce. But despite that, it's done a lot of good It's reached and addressed nooks and crannies which were insulated from scrutiny. So this again is a very unique Indian invention. And also you must remember that this starts from the identity of the Indian Supreme Court as a dual court. Again, it's unique. Probably very few countries in the world with this volume and this creativity and these frontiers have a dual role as a nitty-gritty, bread-butter daily court and also as a constitutional court. There is no division in this. And therefore, and each is important. People now say that you should hive off, you should differentiate. I have generally opposed it because it will weaken the integrity of the Supreme Court. And the nitty-gritty daily bread and butter, sometimes very puerile issues which it decides, are still necessary because they reflect a remarkable vote of confidence by the ordinary person in the Supreme Court. He somehow doesn't feel as bad when he loses in the Supreme Court after having lost everywhere else. And to take away that access to make it an abstract constitutional court or to intermediate a court of appeal as the final court in between may be an issue requiring a far greater discussion. I've tried to identify in earlier lectures 4 or 5 or 6 phases of the Supreme Court in an evolutionary perspective as Granville Austin would have looked at it historically, not as a court deciding X or Y. The first phase was clearly that of the Supreme Court as a consolidator. Call it the 50s and part of the 60s. It was consolidating its jurisprudence. It was heavily reliant on English and other foreign jurisdictions, but it came into its own. It started consolidating on debt in use, on the Gopalan line, but the feature of this first decade or 1.5 decades was a marked pro-individual rights and pro-liberty approach. The second was a bit of a pullback from the 60s to the 70s, late or mid-60s to the mid-70s, and that had partly to do with politics and Mrs. Indira Gandhi. The pullback happened because of a perceived insensitivity to social rights. So this great emphasis on individual rights led to some pullback. It reached its peak, of course, in the early 70s because individual rights prevailed. And then came the pushback from the executive government, and then came a change in the thinking of the Supreme Court. The third phase was, I call it the positivistic Supreme Court from the 70s to the 80s. An excessively deferential court to the executive. You had the ADM Jabalpurs, you had the Liversidge moment of India, and you had the Dred Scott moment of India, both from the UK and the US. And it was clearly a decade-odd period of excessive deference, partly arising from the emergency context, partly arising from the relative feeling of chaos and lawlessness. But be that as it may, clearly it's an identifiable phase of an excessively deferential positivistic court. Look at the text, look at the technicality and decide. Don't go into the larger picture. Fourth was what Upen Bakshi said, a post-emergency quest for legitimation. So you had to do that because you had the Nadirs, the depths of the ADM Jabalpurs. So you had this post-emergency quest for legitimation. And this is the late 80s and 90s in particular, where you have this PIL coming up. You have, of course, the progeny of Justice Bhagwati's initiatives in the 80s, and so on and so forth. So it became an assertive, a individual rights oriented, and a vocal court. Then the fifth phase was, I would say, a greater focus on issues of equality, transparency, social justice, and environment. This is the decade of the mid-90s onwards. Pro-civic amenities, anti-corruption crusades, pro-environment, and of course issues of equality and transparency. And finally, you have now coming up to speed the current Supreme Court through several changing Chief Justices. A more liberal institution, dynamic and forward-looking, looking at frontier issues like privacy, technology, gender issues. Not always getting it right. I'm only commenting about the subject and the phase. I'm not saying he got it right. They got it wrong a lot of times. But those are the broad 6 phases of the Supreme Court. However, this is my oversimplified attempt to put it within the capsule. The inconsistencies within each phase are marked. They don't do any good to the Supreme Court. When we started practice, we used to joke that there are 4 or 5 Supreme Courts functioning in that building. Now we are worried that we are somewhere around 15 to 16 Supreme Courts functioning in that building. And that's not good. That's not good for the power, the strength and the integrity of the institution. Coming back to India's continuing journey, there is of course then the great significant economic revolution. Economic revolution in terms of infrastructure, in various economic spheres, but above all, in the reduction of poverty. Because that's the baseline for India. Now, it's a very complex subject which I can't spend time on because unfortunately, the rules of the football game have been changed every few years as to how to measure poverty. So there is no specific comparator. And a lot of it has to do with politics. And we now have this remarkable concept of multi-dimensional definition of poverty after February 2024. So we don't really know where to put your finger on. Because multi-dimensional is truly multi-dimensional. There was some merit in a statistical measure of poverty. But 2 facts are clear. Between 2009 and 10 and 2009 to 2012, there is a almost 38% reduction of people above the poverty line. Now that translates to crores of persons. I am not very happy with the statistics trotted out now that on multidimensional poverty, rural poverty is 7.2 and urban is 4.6. I find it difficult to believe. But certainly, poverty has declined in large numbers. And that is the fundamental economic achievement of the Indian Republic as it goes beyond 75. And it will accelerate. The other last feature before I go to the other issues is that non-traditional service and technology sectors have taken primacy. Manufacturing and traditional service industry, apart from agriculture, was always the tripartite division. But today, non-traditional service-based industries with a huge input from the diaspora, with a huge disruptive focus. It's quite remarkable that India has, in 2022, 23 startups which became unicorns, third highest in the world. We have aggregated now about 107 unicorns as of 3 years ago. I don't know the latest figures. It'll be much more. And of course, you look around from the Google to the IBM to the MasterCard to the SoftBank to the whatever, YouTube, everywhere there are diaspora Indian heading it, either a CEO or the absolute head. So this is another great development in India's trajectory upwards. Let me now turn to the challenges which face us. We've talked about this great achievement of Indian democracy, its growth in all sectors, its very mature legal system, constitutional democracy, Supreme Court. But it would be incomplete, indeed it would be untruthful, it would be timid, and it would be over-optimistic and unrealistic if we were not to talk of the...
I'm having trouble with the connection. Please try again later.
If we did not look at the several caveats and the conditionalities and the cautions with which all this comes. And as I itemize them, I'm conscious that I may be called anti-national. I'm also conscious that I may even be called seditious and I have enough lawyers to defend me. But as I said, as Palkewala said, sometimes words have to be an assault on the senses for reform to follow. And it would be less than honest not to touch upon them, at least to highlight them. In this whole constitutional system of development, in this constitutional trajectory, in the pride we have in that we remain the only democracy out of those which came out of the yoke of imperialism, the first thing which worries me is the climate of fear, divisiveness, distrust. Now, you need no thermometer, and you don't find it in public conversations, but you find it in every drawing room. You have Big Brother watching. You have an Orwellian atmosphere in so many issues. And if you put your hand on your heart, I don't think any of you can say that you had the same atmosphere a few decades ago. It might sound like politics, but I'm not talking politics. I'm talking of a fact. You can cut a knife on that divisive, distrustful, relatively fearful climate. And that is the antithesis of the pluralism which the Indian democracy and constitution seeks to celebrate. Unless we realize a very simple misconception which follows, that the majority elects, the majority rules, and the majority is the person or the group of persons or the party which is entitled to rule. As Winston Churchill said, majority rule is the worst form of democracy, but it's the best available alternative. So there's no problem with that. But when we say that, we forget one fundamental truth. And that is that the whole purpose of any constitution, forget the Indian constitution, any constitution, is to entrench rights only against the majority. Normal constitutions don't require rights of the majority because they have them. The entrenchment in a constitutional document is always intended to be a bulwark against excessive majoritarianism. So it's a fundamental error to suggest or think that numbers can change eternal values or fundamental rules which are supposed to protect against the misuse of that majority. The second thing which needs comment is the undermining of institutions. See, ultimately an institution is only as good as the man or the woman who heads it. Ambedkar used some very caustic words for this in the Constituent Assembly. Dr. Ambedkar said, if the constitution fails, it is not because it is good or bad. It is because man is vile. And however good an institution, depending on the man or woman, it can run it to ground. However good an architecture of the constitution, you can destroy it. And howsoever poor the architecture, the person who elevates it is very much the personality of that person. One of those institutions which needs special comment is the Election Commission. The Election Commission is a clear pillar of the Indian Constitution, one of the few pillars who are given constitutional status, along with the CAG. The Election Commission has to act not only as an impartial and objective referee, but it has to show that it is bending over backwards to generate trust and faith. For the Election Commission to take refuge in technicalities is counterproductive, because election commissioners come and go, but the damage to the institution becomes irreversible. We have had in the recent past cases where an election commissioner has been punitively handled because he was the only case, all these were argued by me by the way, who wrote a dissent, and he suddenly found Asian Development Bank more enchanting and attractive than a post in the Election Commission. Incidentally, the person who chose the Asian Development Bank was going to become the CEC. He was the only dissenter in an order, by the way, not published. The Election Commission rules don't allow dissents to be published. But he was a dissenter in a 2-1. The fact that when you ask the Election Commission for a combined PDF to analyze votes? The answer which comes is you have got individual constituencies with individual agents who have this. Why don't you aggregate it yourself? Or we'll give you scanned copies. So it takes you 6 months to deal with analysis. Now, I'm not talking again, although it might sound like it, of politics. I'm talking about how the Election Commission has to bend over backwards to elevate its status as an independent body. These are institutions. The main difference between India and Pakistan, the main difference between India and Bangladesh, the main difference between India and even Sri Lanka, or Nepal, or any of our neighbors, or any of those 30, 40 countries which emerged from the yoke of imperialism. Any of them. Africa is full of them. South America is full of them. The main difference is that Nehru made the roots of these institutions very deep and very solid. The institutions took 20 years to create, and luckily Nehru had a long enough life as a Prime Minister. But had these institutions not taken root, we are not very different from our South Asian friends and neighbors. So each institution, it takes brick by brick, increment by increment, 20 years to make it. It takes 20 seconds or 20 minutes to destroy it. 1, 2, 3, 5 incidents over 20 months can destroy it. That is what constitutional institutions have to realize. Take, for example, not in 75 years of Indian history. Let me tell you this. These institutions supposed to exhibit independence have had the series of extensions and reappointments which you have now. Do you know that in all the 75 or 73 odd years, the CBDT chairman was never given an extension except for 2 or 3 months to bridge the gap between the successor and the predecessor? That's a statistical fact. There is no chairman now who does not continue 2-3 years beyond, 1 or 2 years beyond. And after 1 or 2 years extension in CBDT, he would get a Rajya Sabha Secretariat, Secretary General, or a CVC head. This happens with the EC heads also. Now, I don't have to spell out everything for an intelligent audience like you, but this plays havoc for the short term. It may help people, but it plays havoc with institutions in the long run. We have to remember that democracy is not just what governments do, it is what people demand, defend and define. The citizens are the custodians. Social movements like RTI, I don't know if you have a course on RTI in this university. The RTI has never been in tatters more than today. The largest number of vacancies in the entire RTI movement exists today. The best way to cripple an institution is to have vacancies. There are enough hospitals but no doctors to treat you. So there are no people to deal with the RTI. The delay in the RTI system is years and touching decades now. The antithesis of what the RTI was supposed to be 60 days, 90 days, give you a reply. Civil society organizations, investigative journalism and a free media remain indispensable to democratic health. Yet they too face increasing pressures, both from the state and from the marketplace. A democracy without dissent has to be a contradiction. Constitutional morality, a phrase I'm not happy with at all, and now the Supreme Court has sanctified it in many judgments which I have personally argued. A phrase which Dr. Ambedkar discussed at some length in the assembly debates. It refers really to the spirit behind the law. Not the text, not even the context, but the spirit behind all that. It calls on citizens to go beyond legal formalities and nurture a culture of respect, tolerance, and public reasoning. This is the single most vital thing needed in a polarized age and era. Take the bureaucracy as another major pillar. You know that Yes Minister serial, a lovely one, showed you that while being very servile, the actual bureaucrat was the most powerful one. He would take all the decisions. He would stand firm. He'd only humor his minister to make sure that the result was right. I'm not suggesting that the minister be servile, as shown in that serial. But the idea of an independent steel frame, no less than, and we today celebrate, I believe today is the day, we celebrate his 131st birth anniversary, Sardar Patel. He created the civil service, although there's a lot of opposition after the ICS saying an independent civil service in India will be the steel frame. Do you really think today HMV, his master's voice, is the steel frame of the Indian system? Do you really think so? In your heart of hearts? Each outdoes the other to get the promotion. Each outperforms the other to prevent a transfer. And the very purpose of independent objective advice, which is actually going to help you in the long run, is defeated by servile, flattering, platitudinous, and downright wrong advice. Take media, for example. You know, the kind of visual terrorism, verbal extremism, and the biased reportage you see, at least in the visual part of the TVs, in so many channels in the evening. I entered this game long ago, 25 years ago. Every time you see me on TV now, I say no 9 times and I go once, and only 1-1. Because when I started in 2000, etc., the verbal terrorism, visual extremism, and biased reportage did not exist even one fraction of what it is today. You have this remarkable cocktail, a deadly cocktail of ambitious, angled anchors, of pre-committed participants, of conflicts of every possible kind, from ownership to actual performance as anchors. Of course, above all, you have the biggest fraud, which is of course global, but much more so in India, the fraud which I call TRP. So TRP decides what you will see, what you will get, what you will hear. And if you knew that at last count, TRP involved 38,000 meters in a country of 1.5 billion, which at a certain point of time was supposed to indicate to you the preferences of the viewing audience. And therefore, you have this as yet another situation of whether you call it lapdogs or barking dogs or vigilant dogs, but certainly the object of a media, given the status of a fourth organ, is being defeated. India did not have at the central level at all ever this doctrine of cyclical vendetta politics. That's a great big thing for democracy. The cycle of vendetta politics started in one southern state, dominated by film stars. It then travelled to the east and then went to the Battle of Sardars in Punjab. But till recently it was not there in the central system. I don't think that's true anymore. I was intrigued by a cartoon I saw some months ago where an Indian meeting with the Pope. The cartoon says, the Pope says to the Indian that all sins are forgiven if you confess. Apparently the Indian replies that all sins are forgiven if you join the ruling party. There are other issues which I will not go into, but they are very important. Political funding, it's not good for democracy when one set of people have many times more than the total funding of all the others put together. More than that, some of the figures of the amount spent in assembly elections and parliamentary elections in some states are mind-boggling. In a single election crossing 100 crores. You can't have a fair level playing field with that kind of an uneven, non-level expenditure of money. I have so much more, but I will wind up now. Towards the end is reminding you of another system created, unfortunately, a Supari agent system. When Ambedkar discussed governors, he said that governors we may not even find people to appoint as governors because so ornamental, they have no powers. So big debate about elected governors or nominated governors. He said we'll have only nominated governors, and I have my doubt if anybody will want to be a governor because he has no powers. He also said 2 swords can't be in one scabbard. Ek myan mein do talwar nahi. Chief Minister is the elected chap. The elected chap has to be given the right to do wrong, not the unelected governor. But today, unfortunately, from assent to bills, from delaying bills, from interfering in administration, and I'm not talking of any state, it's across, it's a disease which has spread rapidly from Tamil Nadu to West Bengal to Punjab to so many states across India. Friends, maybe this is getting a little too hot for Raj, but let me end by saying that the challenges in the road ahead are that our future is bright, but we have to be aware of the fault lines. We have to remember that all which you face cannot be changed, but nothing can be changed without facing it. And avoiding or not calling out issues or just letting them pass will not do the relevant reform. Price Waterhouse has a very good prognosis for India. It says we will reach a developed country status by 2050. I have the figures, but not the time to give you, which is a very great thing. But it must continue along with all the other values for which we cherish India. In conclusion, as India celebrates 75 years of democracy, as India reclaims the democratic spirit, it must resist the temptation of complacency. The Constitution must not become a museum relic. It must remain a living, breathing text that speaks to each generation. Law must be reclaimed as an instrument of justice, not merely administration. Institutions must serve as beacons of integrity, not instruments of control. And citizens must rise as custodians, not consumers of democracy. Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay.